The deal between Outpost 11 and New London was getting so raw that it could give food poisoning to those that try to eat it. Unfortunately, it was the only deal that was there, and so they didn't have to compete, and didn't have to care as much as they should have done. Coal mines could be built. Although the question was, what to work on next? Drafting machines for more advanced technologies. Considering that temperatures were lowering once again. It was going up and down a number of times. It would be wise to work on things like better heaters, insulation in the form of better housing. Of course, it would require more steel, but wood could be salvaged from the tents that the better housing would provide. Or rather, would be provided for. As it would be an improvement to existing accommodation. Problem is, more than anything, or rather worse in this case, food. Because there wasn't enough to go around. I had the suspicion that New London wanted to starve all those that they didn't agree with to death. With the drafting machines done, the question was, what to work on next? And it was decided to, well, have more scouts, rather the increased availability of scouts to search the frozen waste for more, and perhaps better and more reliable sources of food. Just because they aren't obvious, like New London, it does not mean they aren't around. And more workers and engineers had arrived, so there was enough for quite a bit more research, as well as more medical treatments. And it was time to have the coal mine constructed, because more coal would be needed. And the coal piles had been depleted not that long ago. Thankfully, with enough in the workshops, research would be completed a lot quicker. I had my suspicions around this time. Suspicions that included the possibility that New London wanted to use Outpost 11 as an example to teach the wrong kind of lesson. A lesson that involved something like, oh, I don't know. Seeing things like compassion, restraint as weakness. The belief that only being ruthless and uncaring gets results. Well, we'd see how that would go. But in the meantime, there were still problems with the food supply, even with the super war. additional scouts was my way of planning ahead, because I knew at some point there would be a need for exploring more of the wastes. Once the prerequisite amount of steam cores was gathered, it was switched over to steel. As for what to research next, more efficient heaters were a good idea at the time. Because they were woefully inefficient. They would run out quickly at this rate. And I couldn't have that. As for the scouts, they found the ruins of an inn, or rather what used to be an inn. There were some useful supplies there, though. The fishery looks promising, at least with the possibility of more food. I had a foreboding before the next shipment of food. So I decided to let the scouts go to the frozen den to see if there were any signs of other inhabitants of the wastes besides New London and Outpost 11. Because, like many in Outpost 11, I didn't trust them. Actually, I didn't trust them before they started the reduction of food. And once again, New London was getting impatient. If they wanted someone in charge that would work those within the settlement to death, they should have sent that one instead of me. Do your duty. The age-old cry of the tyrants. Did they expect us to work without food? That denying us that would make us work harder and faster? We weren't their slaves, and yet they acted as slave masters. I have learned from history more than they did. that if you push them too far, those that you're responsible for, they will push back. Often harder than... The heaters, rather the braziers, are now more efficient. As for what to research next, it was considered prudent to have the bunkhouses researched, because better insulated homes would help out greatly. After that, better heaters. To take the additional cold into consideration. At this point, the shipment was sent. The second shipment. Some were hoping that would get New London off our backs.
The shift is over. Time for rest.
I was far more cynical. And I wasn't the only one. Again, especially. She certainly understood enough to know the nature of some individuals. And not just male individuals. The problem with extremes is... oh yes, in New London really tighten the thumb screws by telling us that food will be delivered once the shipment was sent from now on. Well, from that point onwards, I think you can guess what the people's reaction would be. And not a positive one. And I was proven correct, as the people had had enough of New London's actions. A more reliable source of food was needed if Outpost 11 wasn't to starve to death. And there was evidence of that to the south. I admit, even I was losing patience with them. If they wanted someone who could keep things together and manage New London to the point where, oh yes, the fishery had some wood and some raw food. Unfortunately, the ice was too thick to do any fishing. As for where to send the scout next, that food was needed sooner rather than later. So that scout group was called to deliver the raw food, among other things. This equipment is acting up again. My apologies. Well, that raw food. At the time, I believed it would make the difference between life and death. It would certainly give that scout party moving south time to find an alternative food source.
Counts on us.
New London's loyalty was unearned. So many were asking, why should we do anything for them when they're doing less for us? I knew that it would only be a matter of time before it became open conflict.